Hi, everyone. I'm Mickey Burdick. I'm one of the co-organizers of this event. I'm a assistant professor at the University of Delaware. So welcome to our Repro and Religion Public Pedagogies project. This virtual conversation series, which we've already had three of in the fall, and now we're going to have three of, starting with this amazing one, it's all sponsored by the Luce AAR Advancing Public Scholarship Grant Program and is part of the Reproductive Righteousness Program. The three of us pictured on the right are the series organizers, Dr. Risa Cromer and Dr. Leah Terragon-Zeller. And we're so excited to bring experts on religion and reproduction and other various insights and theories and practices into interdisciplinary conversations to support a community of scholars, advocates, and practitioners on these often underaddressed, unfortunately, topics. So we're motivated to gather in a time of obvious intensifying hostility to reproductive, trans, queer, racial, and other human rights. We believe in open public discussion about the intersections of reproductive politics and their various axes, and we believe that it's as urgent as ever to address these things. So we'll be playing some different roles today. So Risa, one of our co-organizers, will be somewhat of our tech MC today. Please send a message directly to her and to me if anyone is having issues. And I will also introduce the event and speakers, our speaker today. And we'll have hopefully a wonderful conversation with our honored guest today. So we are thrilled to have the incredible Rebecca Nagle with us today. I, for one, am a little bit starstruck because I love your work, so thank you for all you do. Rebecca Nagle is an award-winning journalist and citizen of Cherokee Nation. She's the author of By the Fire We Carry, The Generation-Long Fight for Justice on Native Land, and the writer and host of the podcast This Land. Her writing on Native representation, federal Indian law, and tribal sovereignty has been featured in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The Guardian, USA Today, Indian Country Today, and many more. Rebecca Nagle is the recipient of the Lucas Book Prize, the American Mosaic Journalism Prize, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, a Peabody nominee, and the Women's Media Center's Exceptional Journalism Award. Nagle lives in Toluca, Oklahoma. And Indigenous communities deserve the same standard of journalism, she says, and we agree, as the rest of the country, but rarely receive it from non-Native media outlets. So Nagle's journalism seeks to correct this. From the census to COVID to the Supreme Court, Nagle focuses on deeply and timely reporting that sheds light on issues of national importance. Thank you so much for being here, Rebecca. We're really happy to have you. And basically, we want to kind of begin by talking through some previous questions and then open up the floor for anyone to ask you some questions as well. So feel free to put comments and questions in the chat at any point. So before we do this, I will just kind of start with a general question. So many of us are familiar with your incredible work here, part of why we're here, but we would love if you could tell us a bit about yourself and your work for your audience today.
Yeah, Oceanica, Gohin Daudon, Tadek Janelle, Jellica Yeshi, Gayla, Joplin, Missouri, Otessadola, Digagi Gayelage, Sarah Michael Dundon, Agalise Chigesa, Francis Polson Dudon, Tlaiko Utesa. My name is Rebecca Nagle. I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation. I live here in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. I was born in Joplin, Missouri, and yeah, just really excited to be here today. Like you guys said, I have written and hosted a couple seasons of a documentary podcast called This Land. The second season was an investigation into how the far right was using custody battles over Native kids in federal litigation to try and dismantle tribal sovereignty. And that in a case that made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And so it was an investigation into the underlying custody cases themselves, which had been misrepresented both in the courts and in the media, and an investigation into the forces behind the lawsuit and why they had chosen attacking this law called the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA for short, as a vehicle to try and attack tribes and tribal sovereignty. Also, the author of a book called By the Fire We Carry: The Generations Long Fight for Justice on Native Land. And that book is about how a murder in 1999 turned into a Supreme Court battle over the Muskogee Reservation. And so a Muskogee citizen named Patrick Murphy murdered another Muskogee citizen on Muskogee land and was sentenced to death by the state of Oklahoma. But over the course of his death penalty appeals, Patrick argued that Oklahoma didn't actually have jurisdiction to execute him because the crime happened on his tribe, Muskogee Nation's reservation. Oklahoma, the state of Oklahoma, claimed that that reservation had not existed for over 100 years. And so that central question of whether or not Muskogee Nation still had a reservation basically made its way all the way to the Supreme Court. Ultimately, the High Court sided with the tribe. Based on that decision, 8 other reservations here in eastern Oklahoma were affirmed, including my tribe's reservation, Cherokee Nations. And taken together, it represents the largest restoration of tribal land in U.S. history.
Yeah. Thank you so much for like all the work that you do around sort of bringing all these issues to light and things that you're right that are not often brought to light in sort of everyday Western media. So thank you so much. Your book that came out last year that you mentioned, By the Fire We Carry, I think is a powerful story of land sovereignty and resistance by Indigenous peoples in Oklahoma. We'd love to know, how do you see your work? And there's some obvious connections here, but how do you see your work on Indigenous sovereignty to contributing to conversations around things like religion and reproductive politics?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sovereignty is really about self-determination and for Indigenous people. And so, to back up, I think what's really important is that it's inherent. And so sometimes people think that sovereignty is something that, the government grants or gives to tribes. But we and our right to our lands, our culture, our languages, and our right to self govern actually predates the creation of the United States. And so our sovereignty isn't something that is granted or that is given, it's something that is inherent. Now, of course, colonization has impacted the kind of sovereignty that our tribes can exercise. And so a lot of what you see in what people call federal Indian law is this battle over tribes fighting for self determination, fighting for sovereignty, and the forces of American colonization pushing back against that. And so we have a very complex, sometimes what contradictory frame of what that sovereignty means in practical ways today in the United States. And so it's something that, Native nations are definitely still fighting for. Yeah, and I think one of the ways that sovereignty manifests, and I think we'll get into this in more detail in later questions, but there's a really big relationship between the sovereignty that Native nations have under U.S. law and the sovereignty that Indigenous individuals have over our bodies, whether it's, our access to healthcare, reproductive freedoms, living free from violence. All of those things are really impacted by colonization and the ways that U.S. law can limit sovereignty and self-determination. And the practice of religion is also part of that. And so often in colonization, this idea of Christianity or civilization, as it was often called, was often the tip of the spear of colonization. And at the beginning of like the European conquest of the globe, the sort of rationalization for that was sort of dividing nations into Christian and non-Christian nations. And so a lot of really through before the United States was a country through the 20th century, a lot of US policy was sort of wrapped up in this idea of civilizing or oftentimes that meant Christianizing Indigenous peoples. And so all those things are very connected.
Yes, 100%. And I mean, you've bravely reported on and advocated for mothers and parents and women and survivors your entire career. I especially really appreciate the second season of This Land, where you talk and delve deep into ICWA and the impact it has on families and how the media portrays Indigenous parenting and historically and even contemporarily. Which it's an incredible season and everyone should listen to it, especially with all that's going on right now. And you mentioned it briefly, but I'm curious, what role do you believe that reproductive justice specifically as a framework, as a practice, plays in your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you look at the history of colonization, one of the tactics has always been taking Indigenous children. And so that's manifested in a few different ways over history. So people are starting to be more aware of the program of what people called Indian boarding schools. And so from the 1870s to the 1930s, well, and really in like much longer than that, but that 6 year period is sort of the height of it, although like it continues much later. About a third of Native kids were taken from their families, taken from their tribes, taken from their cultures, and taken from their languages, and forced to attend um, federally run boarding schools. Sometimes the schools were also run by religious institutions. And at the schools, kids were punished for speaking their languages. The idea was to assimilate Native people to white society. And so the students were taught things like farming, or the girls were taught like domestic arts. And so it was also, it like had a lot to do with also like gender roles were really reinforced there. And then also the schools were places of widespread physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. And in the past few years, both here in the United States and in Canada, there have been the discovery of mass graves at the historic sites of these boarding schools, unmarked graves of the children who died there because they were so violent. And also, the kids face things like malnutrition, not proper medical care, and abuses like that. And so that practice of taking Indigenous children in a systematic way actually repeated itself in the 50s and the 60s. And so at that time, in the late 60s, there was a big national study that found about a third of Native kids, again, had been taken out of their home, with the majority of those kids being either adopted out or placed in foster care in non-Native homes. And so, in response to that, Congress passed the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, which protects. I mean, it's basically ICWA is a complicated statute. It does a lot of different things, but I think of it as sort of like a set of guardrails, so that if a child is put into foster care, or if a Native child is put up for adoption, it helps keep that child connected, first to their blood relatives, second to their tribe, and then third to the broader Native community. And it makes it harder for people to practice some of the predatory things that were happening, whether it was, social workers taking kids just because, they were living with a grandma instead of their biological parents, or because the family was poor. And also the abusive practices we see sometimes with adoption attorneys trying to take Native kids because they just frankly need more babies to put up for adoption. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that those are things that have happened to Native people historically. I think another really important policy to talk about is forced sterilization, which happened in the 60s and the 70s through the Indian Health Services, which is the federal program that is responsible for providing health care to Native people. And so a lot of Native women were sterilized without their consent, and many without their knowledge. And the practice actually targeted people who were there's this concept among Native, well, it's like was created by the federal government, and then it still exists within many tribes, this idea of blood quantum, and sort of what fraction of percent Native you are. And the practice targeted people who were higher blood quantum or who were full blood. And yeah, I mean, even if you look like specifically among Cherokees at that time, the birth rate during the sort of fourth sterilization period among Cherokees fell dramatically. Um, and then I would say the last thing that is a federal policy that's good for people to know about is because IHS is federally funded, um, we're subject to the Hyde Amendment. And so for people who don't know, IHS or Indian Health Services is the federal agency that delivers healthcare to tribal citizens. And that healthcare is delivered through IHS facilities that are run by IHS, through facilities that, through the Indian Self-Determination Act, are run by tribes. So tribes can contract with IHS and like run our hospitals and run our clinics ourselves. And then there are also like urban Indian health centers. So in cities where there's a lot of Native folks living there, there can be clinics and things through IHS that provide services in those cities. And so, I mean, there are lots of problems with IHS. It's chronically underfunded. A working group of tribal leaders and health advocates recently put out a report outlining how what IHS needs compared to its current funding level, what IHS actually needs to meet patient needs is 10 times what Congress is currently funding it at. And so it's actually one of the oldest federal health programs. So the creation of IHS actually predates Medicare and Medicaid, but it's not funded like Medicare and Medicaid. So Medicare and Medicaid are funded as what's called entitlement programs. So if you qualify for Medicare, you get Medicare. And then every year Congress is like, okay, well, this is how many people get Medicare. This is how much money we need for Medicare. And IHS isn't like that. It's the opposite, where Congress is like, well, this is how much we feel like spending on IHS. So here you go. And amongst yourselves, you all figure it out. And so even though, I mean, there's a stereotype around Native people getting free things, but even though we have a treaty right to access healthcare, Native people actually have like a really high level of medical debt, because what will happen is people will use what's called contract health, where we might go outside of IHS to get services, but then IHS is supposed to pay for it. But because there's that lack of funding, when IHS doesn't cover the bill, then Native people are getting strapped with that debt. And so there's just a lot of problems within IHS. But then specifically, when you look at access to reproductive care, the Hyde Amendment is one of the big things that gets in the way. And I think now, when you look at states that have near or total abortion bans, oftentimes they're in places where there's like really high levels of, Native people, whether it's places like Oklahoma or the Dakotas. So it's definitely something that impacts our communities.
Yeah, thank you for that, like, very like broad but also deep overview. I feel like sometimes, we understand reproductive justice as just beyond legality and choice alone. And I think it's really helpful to understand that even pre-Roe, right, even pre-Dobbs, there's these barriers for Indigenous folks across the country. So thank you for highlighting those. Um, I am curious, Rebecca. You report on, like, a lot of these things, a lot of really impactful, controversial for maybe folks who don't like you report on, a lot of right-wing folks who have a lot of opinions on things. Um, and you report very bravely and unabashedly, pro-justice. Um, I'm wondering what you see as some of the main challenges, but also some of the main opportunities for the topics you report on and the stories you share. So, what are some examples of maybe challenges or opportunities for some of the stories that you tell and that you share and um, that you report on and that win awards for and do amazing work for?
Yeah, I mean, to kind of zoom out in our country, one of the barriers that I think all Native people face, but that, is a barrier as like a Native storyteller that I come up against, is the systematic erasure of Native people from news, pop culture, just like our broader society. And so, when you look at, like who is staffing newsrooms, Native people are a fraction of a fraction of a percent. When you look at who is represented in news stories, who's included, again, Native people are a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a percent. And over again, where we should be included in national stories, whether it's talking about, Robert F. Kennedy using federal health data, hello IHS, to like track who has autism, or reports about enrollment of minority students at Ivy Leagues following the Harvard decision. Over and over in that reporting, Native people are just kind of were erased. And so I think some of the biggest barriers I face, I mean, and this is just from personal experience, is trying to convince non-native editors and outlets that our stories are relevant and that they matter, because they're not even coming to people's mind or people's consciousness. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, and based on that erasure, I think the average person in the United States knows little to nothing about tribes and tribal sovereignty. A recent study found that over 80% of US adults cannot name one living contemporary Native person. The overwhelming majority of people in the United States have never met a Native person or don't know a Native person personally. And so, where we exist in people's consciousness is often this sort of like this distant past and this sort of like abstract um figure in the past, and not as like contemporarily living, breathing, real Native people. And I think that often, very often, our media just perpetuates those kinds of narratives, and is very responsible for perpetuating that. So I think that that's like, for me, one of the biggest challenges is coming up against that, both professionally with the people that I'm working with, and then also coming up against that, I think, just like in the public consciousness, is sort of just like constantly trying to push back against that erasure. In terms of opportunities, I think that I think that there is growing visibility of Native people in the United States that I think goes back to Standing Rock and the water protectors in the fight over the Dakota Access Pipeline. I think that that was a moment where, for the first time in a very long time, Native advocacy and Native issues, were in the news and like captured national attention. And so I think what you have seen coming out of that, and I think some spaces have been slower than others. I actually don't think that journalism has shifted very much. But I think you have seen some bigger shifts in like television and film. Publishing, I think, is having an exciting moment with like more Native writers and more Native books. And so I think that there's some opportunity there, where I think there's a little bit more of an appetite for Native stories than there was maybe 10 years ago.
I have a follow-up to sort of, your career and, dealing with all these obstacles. What kind of, I mean, obviously, besides just your obvious deep personal connection, but what inspires you to keep going? Who inspires you to keep going? And, to actually report and tell stories, and, keep going, even though we live in really interesting times. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think just the work is really important. And, I believe in the power of storytelling for social and political change. I believe in the theory of the problem that our erasure and our invisibility are really big barriers to things like funding or better policy or tribal sovereignty. Like if we live in a country where the majority of US citizens don't even know what tribal sovereignty is, that's it's going to be hard to have a Congress or to have a court system that upholds and respects it, because the people in Congress don't know what tribal sovereignty is, right? Like it's the ignorance is systemic and is throughout. And so I do really think that those policy shifts are really key and really important to creating change. And so yeah, so that's a big part of what keeps me going. And so just in that way that I believe in the theory of the problem, I think I believe in the theory of change. That is, if we can like shift the narrative and push back against the systemic erasure, we will have better policies that improve people's quality of life.
I mean, that's all we can do, right? And
Yeah.
keep going. Yeah. This is kind of, this last sort of question. I encourage people to, this is a really cool opportunity for people to ask Rebecca questions, and, have her here to answer them, which is wonderful. So I encourage you all to, put your questions in the chat. And after this last question, just going through it, we'll open it up kind of to everybody. To talk about whatever you'd like with Rebecca and her amazing work. But you talked a little bit about this, but obviously, we've always lived in chaotic and uncertain times. But we are currently in a very chaotic and uncertain time in the US context. And I'm curious, what advice would you give for those of us, hopefully all of us in this room, who feel called to unearth injustice like you do, but also to resist injustice?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I actually think like I've been thinking about this a lot about how people I think are rightfully talking about the rise of fascism and the rise of autocracy within US politics. And I think it's very scary, right? I don't want to live in a fascist state. But I think that there are aspects of fascism that have always been part of the United States that we have chosen to ignore or push aside. And there's actually this theory of fascism from like the World War II era, and looking at what happened in Europe, of talking about fascism being as like sort of the boomerang effect of colonialism, of sort of colonialism coming back and being those policies that Europeans were implementing, in Africa and in Asia and in Latin America, coming back and being exercised on the citizens of Europe. And I think we're in an interesting moment where we're seeing some of those things play out in the United States, like when we want to talk about like unbridled executive power, right? Or power of government power without checks and balances. There's this funny term that has come up in federal Indian law called plenary power, to talk about like what kind of power, it's usually used in the realm of Congress, but like what kind of like unilateral policy making power the US has over Indigenous nations. And so I think we often think about like, and there's a legal scholar named Maggie Blackhawk who has written about this in depth and with a lot of eloquence. But I think as U.S. citizens, we think about like our rules order or our laws or our constitution as the laws that govern in. But as long as we have existed as a country, we have exerted power over people who were not U.S. citizens, whether that were citizens of U.S. nations or the people who lived in Guam or Puerto Rico or migrants at our border. And so there have always been people who the US exerted power over who didn't have the liberties and protections of our Constitution. And I think we have a history in our country of ruling not just by consent, by conquest. And so these moments where we're seeing our, democratic government do things that are wildly anti-democratic, that's not new. And the hope, which was like, I know the point of this question, is that people keep looking to like Hungary or Russia or like Nazi Germany to be like, how do you resist totalitarianism? And I'm just like, we don't have to go abroad for those lessons. Native nations, particularly, but also like other people who've been colonized by the United States, have survived these waves of violence. I mean, we've lived through having our religions outlawed. We've lived through having like our self-governance outlawed. We've lived through these kinds of totalitarian policies. And we've done really interesting, I think, ingenious and smart things to maintain and protect the things that were important to us. And so I think there's a lot to learn from Native nations, and whether it's the ways that we've created like worlds and systems outside of the US government, but also the ways that we've interacted with the US government. So I'll just tell one story, which is so during the 1830s, the US adopted a policy of ethnic cleansing, where it forcibly removed Indigenous people who were then living within like the boundaries of the United States to west of the Mississippi. And during the removal, which was people, didn't have proper shelter, didn't have proper clothing, cholera was spreading and other diseases. There was just mass death. So, you see like with Choctaw Nation, like a third of the population died. With Cherokee Nation, like an estimated quarter of the population died. And so Cherokees, because we had refused to go, we were actually rounded up and herded into concentration camps. And while we were in the concentration camps, the government of Cherokee Nation negotiated with the US Army for us to oversee our own deportation. And so instead of it being administered by the Army, we administered it so that less people would die. And you see Native people do that over and over again, where we take the kind of the apparatus of how colonialism is showing up in our life, and we take it over to make our day-to-day lives better. And so I think that's just like one of the many lessons that people could be learning at this time from Native nations. So that's my spiel.
No, I think that's great. Are there any other, I'm wondering, this is just kind of an additional question to that, but are there ways that you've seen specifically, I'm thinking about, just kind of coming back to how you've focused on sort of the systematic erasure of Native peoples, but also Native women and families in media. Are there any ways that you've seen really really inspiring ways that specifically Native women and families and children have sort of, fought back against those injustices?
Yeah, that's a good question. When you look at, it's been a while since I reported
Yeah.
on this, but I did an article, gosh, like 6 or 7 years ago for the Women's Media Center. And at that time, this may no longer still be true, but at that time, when you looked at the speaking roles that Native women had in film and television, like a
Mm.
really high percentage of those characters were experiencing sexual violence. And so like one of the stereotypes on the screen, which Native women are also experiencing in real life, is that we're just like these victims of violence. Um, I think too, the erasure of Native people, when you look at marginalized groups, I mean, it's, always this way, but when you look at marginalized groups within the Native community, and I would say Native women are part of this, the erasure is double, right? And so while there may be only like a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of representation of Native men, then, for Native women, that's even smaller. I think some of the examples of the ways that Native women have pushed back against that to me are the most exciting, are in this sphere of politics. And so I think political leaders like Sharice Davids, Peggy Flanagan, Deb Haaland. Peggy Flanagan is the Lieutenant Governor of Minnesota. Sharice Davids is in Congress and was one of the first Native women to be elected to Congress. Deb Haaland was also one of the first Native women to be elected to Congress, and then was the Secretary of the Interior. And she was the first Native person to ever hold any cabinet position ever. And she's now running for governor of New Mexico. And if she wins, she would be the first Native woman to be a governor of any state. And so, to me, I think that some of those women are the most inspiring in terms of being possibility models for younger Native women and kind of showing, what's possible for Native women today.
Really cool. That's amazing. Um, before I have a million questions, I as someone who I study, Christian nationalism and, sort of the alt-right, women in the alt-right movement, things like that. And so I have a million questions for you, and I'm sure a lot of us do. I would love for other people to kind of jump in if anyone has a question.
Yeah, would it be possible to weigh in here, Rebecca? Thank you so much. I'm a huge fan and follower of your work, and learner of your ideas. Um, you said so poignantly how Christianity has was the tip of the spear of colonization, and certainly in the aftermath of colonialism, as you report on, how Christianity has played an integral role in undermining ICWA. I'm wondering if there is also, you talk about how religion has been the target, Indigenous religions have been the target of colonial power. And I'm wondering if there are any stories or insights you have around how religion informs some of the social and political change that inspires you or the communities that you report on, um, or identify with.
Yeah, yeah. So to back up, I think just to give some context for people who don't know, when so at the same time that colonization was happening in Europe, it was also like the Enlightenment, right? So it was like this idea of like human rights, basically, which is like an oversimplification. But and so there sort of had to be like an order to like, why are we talking about like the inherent rights of people, but then also like colonizing folks? And then there was also a need to sort of divide up like what parts of the globe which European countries could colonize. And so this thing developed called the doctrine of discovery, which was first like a papal bull, but like basically like a decree from the Pope. But then other religious institutions adopted it and issued similar things. But it was basically the idea that Christian nations had the right to take whatever they wanted from non-Christian nations, whether that be, land, gold, or people, in as we see in the institution of slavery. And that doctrine of discovery is actually embedded in US law through a Supreme Court decision in the early 1800s. And so as like land disputes and indigenous rights and how all that stuff was going to work out, US courts had to figure out, and eventually the Supreme Court had to figure out, how do Europeans and how does the United States like even have the right to this land in the beginning? And they went back to the doctrine of discovery. And so, Britain had the right to this land by the right of discovery. And then US, because US fought a war with Britain and then won, like inherited that right from the crown, is what the Supreme Court said, which, that was the early 1800s. It was a while ago, but the doctrine of discovery has been cited by the Supreme Court as recently as 2005, and then by appellate federal courts even more recently. And so it's still part of the bedrock and the foundation of American law and colonialism. And it really informs, the first like civilization fund. So like money that the federal government was spending on this idea of like civilizing Indians was again in the early 1800s, and you see these kinds of civilization policies really up through the mid 20th century. And so, I mean, there's a couple hundred years of whether it's, you know, missionary schools or boarding schools. I mean, they originally like first gave the money to like Christian missions. Um, or boarding schools or the Indian relocation program, this idea of civilization has been part of US policy, and this idea of like dismantling tribes and dismantling tribal identification and tribal people for most of US history. And for a lot of that history, the idea of Christianity was really centered. And so I think it's really important. And then, you know, in terms of Indigenous people fighting back, I mean, I think one thing that's really important is that Native people found ways to continue our practices, whether that was doing it in places where people couldn't see, whether it's things like Native American church, where like people are melding Christianity with traditional Native practices or Native ceremonies. And then ultimately, you know, we have, I'm forgetting the exact wording of the name of the act, but basically like a Religious Freedom Act, where, you know, now we have the right, you know, and that act protects our right to practices without government intrusion, but also things like access to sacred sites and things like that, which is still an ongoing issue, you know, where there are places where people need certain access to certain plants or certain medicines, or even just certain like specific places that have like religious significance, something that Indigenous people are still fighting for. um yeah, so that's kind of an overview of the history and the resistance. And so, you know, I think it's really important. You know, another aspect that is going on that has a lot to do with Indigenous belief systems that I feel like doesn't get talked about enough is language. And so, I mean, I can't speak for every tribe, but for Cherokees, like our ceremonies are very tied to our languages, and there's a lot in our ceremonial spaces that you can't do without the Cherokee language. And because of both the boarding school policy and also how students who only spoke Cherokee were treated in Oklahoma public schools, and obviously like lots of, you know, centuries of policies, not just those two, we're at a place where our language is very endangered. And if we don't create new speakers and new speakers fast, in, you know, a few decades, there won't be any living speakers left. Most of our fluent speakers are over the age of 60. So we're in this really scary place. And the majority of tribes in the United States are in a similar place where either they only have a handful of speakers left. But basically, the majority of tribes are in a place where kids aren't growing up speaking their language, right? And so that's kind of what gets you on the path to endangered languages. And it's really hard because other groups, even other oppressed groups in the United States, like don't have that same problem the way that Indigenous communities do. And so there's not really an infrastructure of support for it. There's like really very, I mean, actually the Henry Luce Foundation, I think is like one of the only foundations that like supports Indigenous languages, but there's just not really a network within philanthropy. And then the federal funding for Indigenous language revitalization is just a very small amount, and is just not enough to address the crisis. And so, you know, there are lots of different challenges to Indigenous people being able to continue to practice like our ceremonies. And there are like structural reasons why those, I mean, challenges exist. And I think that for non-native people, I think what's important is to think about like what are, without like, you know, wanting to like be like sitting in the sweat lodge or whatever, you know, like without like trying, I mean, that's a whole other topic of like how native religions are being like, since the New Age era, like appropriated and commodified. I think that also gets in the way of people actually being able to like connect with and participate in their cultures. But there are some structural things like funding for Indigenous language programs that have a really big impact on people's abilities to be able to practice those ceremonies and carry that knowledge and pass it on to future generations.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for that answer. That was really educational. I learned I've been learning a lot from you today, so thank you. Um, so I'll read a couple of questions and kind of synthesize some things that are going on in the chat so that we can get to an answer for them. Um, Someone mentioned how you've been talking about sort of the systematic erasure of Native people in the media, and that it's really important to bring more stories of Native people to change policies and laws that then impact them and all of us. So do you have any recommendations about how we can use our voices to advocate for getting more Native voices and stories heard? Um,
Yeah, absolutely. Complain. I feel so alone when I'm like, but when you see like news stories that don't like just don't include people. Like I'll give an example. So during the COVID pandemic, the New York Times published this article that at the time got a lot of like play. They had sued the CDC for racial data around COVID-19 and death, and they published an article that was the most comprehensive look at the COVID and race yet, or whatever was that headline. And it didn't include Native people. There was like passing mention of like Navajo Nation having a really high rate. But they made no effort to actually like look at what was happening nationally, because that would require time and resources, right? Like that would require them putting effort into reporting on Native communities, and they don't care. And so I think when things like that happen, oftentimes it's just Native people kind of sounding the alarm and pushing back, and they don't care when we complain. Like literally the now it's called IJA. At the time it was the Native American Journalists Association. Now it's the Indigenous Journalists Association. Um, Issued a whole report on how the New York Times coverage is inaccurate, includes a lot of racism and bias and stereotypes. And the New York Times didn't take any meaningful steps to address like the issues brought up in that report, and actually um, had some pretty like bad behavior towards Elijah after that. So it's often Native people and Native journalists pushing back against those inaccuracies, and I think it's frankly going to take just like more people. And then on the positive side, I think what people can do is just support Indigenous media. And so I always say, like, where do you get your information? Like, are you on Instagram? Are you on TikTok? Are you a podcast person? Are you like a digital subscriber? Are you on Substack? Like, find the Native voices in those places where you get your information about the world, and the places that you use to make sense of the world. Like if you love novels, even stuff like at that level, like add Native voices to the things that you're reading and watching and listening to.
Great. So we should complain, and we're going to go find Native
Yeah.
voices and stories, which is great, and great
Yeah.
calls to action that we can all do. So thank you for that. This other question talks about, based on your experiences and knowledge, do you have any insights into the way that maybe Indigenous frameworks of, things like RJ, reproductive justice, or reproductive sovereignty, different frameworks, some that you've talked about today, can protect and uplift specifically Two-Spirit and trans
Hmm.
non-binary Indigenous peoples situated specifically under US colonialism?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm Two-Spirit, I'm queer, and I think that reclaiming our traditional knowledge about the roles of Two-Spirit people in our communities and in our societies as Indigenous people is an ongoing process. Obviously, a lot of that was impacted by colonization, and so homophobia and transphobia was not just introduced to our communities, but in many ways, like violently forced upon them. And so reclaiming the roles of Two-Spirit people in society is really important. And so, I mean, I think that people are doing that in a lot of different ways. So, I mean, the biggest ways is that like Two-Spirit folks have just been organizing themselves for a long time. I mean, the word Two-Spirit was created by like gay and lesbian Native elders in like the 90s, you know? And then since then, there are Two-Spirit societies that have formed across the country, many that are regional and many that are providing kind of direct support and community to local Two-Spirit folks. I sit on the board of a new national organization that's working to be like a resource and an advocacy organization for Two-Spirit called the Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ Center for Justice and Equity. And so look out for us. And also, yeah. And so, I mean, I think that I think it also depends on the tribe. Like my tribe recently, well, not that recently, a while ago, supports gay marriage. And so like within my tribe, we have gay marriage, but there are, even though, you know, gay marriage has passed in the United States and it's the law for now, it's something that many tribes still don't recognize. So there's that kind of work. I think there's a lot of work to be done I mean, I think that, you know, in tribal communities, just like in the broader United States, that like transphobia can often be worse than homophobia and like more violent, and especially like the kind of discrimination that exists specifically against trans women. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done, both in terms of including trans women and trans folks more broadly, like in our community, specifically like in ceremony. Like that's a big issue here in Oklahoma, is like the inclusion of trans women and ceremonial spaces. Yeah, so there's a lot, but I think you know, two spirits have always like found each other and like organized together. And so there's also a lot of grassroots organizing that's happening that I think is really great.
That's awesome. And what was the organization again that you were telling us to look out for, Rebecca?
Oh yeah, the Two Spirit. Oh my gosh, it's such a long name. The Two
Sorry.
Spirit Native LGBTQ Center for Equity. Yes.
Amazing. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for repeating it too. We got a couple of questions, sort of about current issues, you know, facing Indigenous and Native communities. So for instance, what are some legislation or cases coming up that we should look up, or support or not? And also, as you noted, a lot of people don't know, a lot of white Western folks don't know a lot about Indigenous sovereignty, and the inherent right to sovereignty for Native peoples, and some of the historical and current issues impacting Native communities today. So how do you recommend we continue to divest from colonial and white supremacist systems while still, you know, fighting for legal justice as well in these spaces?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, in terms of bills, I think probably one of the biggest battlegrounds right now is over funding. So, I mean, you know, just like with all the federal funding cuts, tribes are being wrapped up and targeted in that. And even though our legal status under US law is as a political group, not a racial group, some tribal programs have been kind of labeled and then targeted as DEI. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot to be done there. So, like, for example, like I talked about IHS, there's like big cuts to IHS that have been proposed. There are big cuts to housing that have been proposed in the current budget. You know, there was this really beautiful like food distribution program that some Alaskan tribes were doing that they had to cancel at the last minute because their funding got cut. You know, Wind River had a solo project where like the money they were supposed to get for their or actually I think it was wind turbines, the wind power project that got cut. And so I think the biggest issue right now is around funding. And it's the issue of funding for tribes is different than it is for the rest of the US population, because the US government has what's called a trust responsibility to Native nations. And so, as Native nations signed legal agreements with the US called treaties, in which we exchange billions of acres of land, without which the US wouldn't really exist as it does today. Um, Certain guarantees were made, right? So guarantees around education, housing. I mean, often the loss of land interrupted our lifeways and our ability to sustain ourselves. So the government would be like, we will provide you food, we will provide you housing, we will provide you these things in exchange for the land. And so the funding for those things isn't the obligation of the federal government to fund those things isn't just about sort of like the morality of whether or not like Native people should have access to housing. It's a treaty right that under the US Constitution, treaties are the supreme law of the land. And so there's an extra layer of violation in the federal funding cuts that have been proposed and that have been happening. And so I think that that's honestly like the biggest issue that's happening right now.
How do you recommend that we, I'm curious, sort of, I know that you've talked a lot about different, frameworks and kind of thinking about things through, things like boomerang colonialism, Indigenous sovereignty as obviously inherent, and then also reproductive justice. So I'm wondering, how do we balance? Maybe this is kind of a too broad or too complex of a question, but how do you balance sort of like the um, understanding that legal rights are needed and supporting those, but also divesting from things like colonialism and white supremacy and Christian nationalism? I know you write a lot about um, those issues, and I'm curious, like, how you're sort of thinking about it and historically, contemporarily, thinking about those issues overlapping with the systems that, give funding and legal rights and things like that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing is that like I think that you can critique like the US government and federal Indian law, and yeah, obviously it's like deeply flawed and deeply problematic, but it doesn't exist without Native agency. And so generations of Native people have shaped it. I mean, the like reason the Articles of Confederation failed and that are like we created like a federal government and have our well, modernish, but like our present day constitution has a lot to do with Indian affairs and Indigenous resistance. Like the reasons for the Revolutionary War have a lot to do with Indian affairs and Indigenous resistance. And so I think that the impact of Native people on the United States and in is profound, right, and is foundational. And so I think sometimes these sort of like, well, it's all colonialism, like we shouldn't interact with it at all. I think if you look at our history as Native nations, those aren't the choices that our ancestors were making. There were times that our ancestors chose um, armed resistance. I mean, obviously, generations and centuries of our ancestors chose armed resistance, but they also used tactics like diplomacy, like advocacy, petitions, going into the Bureau of Indian Affairs and taking it over, all of these things. And also our ancestors like made a lot of compromises. And I think they knew that the compromises that they were making, and I don't think you survive the level of colonialism and genocide that we survived without making compromises, and without making compromises based on not what is just here, but how do we get through while experiencing like the least amount of harm, knowing we're going to experience a lot of harm. And so yeah, I mean, I don't really have a framework around like what's the morality of like an outside inside strategy. My North Star is really like, how does this impact people's lives? Like what is the impact of this work? Because yeah, I think that US, our the current iteration of our country is the totality of all of the problematic and oppressive things, but also all of the people who have pushed back against those things. And so it's neither all or nothing. And also, I think that when we look at the relationship between the law and the lives that oppressed people live, um, oppressed people have always exercised rights that the law says they don't have. Like we've always found ways outside of the law, whether that's still accessing abortion, whether that's Native people still practicing our religions when they're outlawed. We have always found ways outside of the law to exist. And I think we also see that when the law does protect the rights of oppressed people or reign in power, right, that the law is not always followed, right? And so there's not this like one-to-one correlation between the law and what people's lived experiences too. And so I think that's just something to keep in mind. Also, I think that like we're living in a moment of I don't know if it's increased, but maybe like increased awareness. But we're living in a moment of lawlessness, right? Which I think is just like part of the United States. I mean, so much of what has happened to Indigenous people throughout history has been illegal. So, the US created a system of law by which to take our land and then like didn't even follow its own rules. Because in large part because we pushed back and created a rule system where we were able to preserve things. And then, when the United States butted up against that, they would be like, oh, well, never mind. Like, we're going to get rid of these rules. And so, yeah, I think that yeah, I'm trying to think of where I was going with that. But I think in this moment of sort of how do you interact with the law versus like not, I mean, I think either approach is valid. And I think when you look, at least when I look through Native history, I think we have examples of our ancestors doing both.
I think that's a really wonderful answer to a really complex question. So thank you. I think that's why your work is so inspiring to me because you tell stories of real people who are affected by these laws and continue to fight, both within and outside of them to protect their families and communities and really protect, honestly, all of our rights in some ways. So I think it's really cool. A lot of people have been asking what you're working on now. So I'd love to hear what you're working on now. If you have a big project after your, 2 seasons of your podcast and your book, and your, just general oeuvre of incredible journalism. So if you had limitless research and storytelling time, what additional stories would you want to tell? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. Time, man, the biggest constraint. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I'm working on now is that I'm really most excited about is a collaboration with some other Indigenous scholars to speak to how both the US's treatment of Indigenous people, but also our resistance has fundamentally shaped US democracy. Um, in ways that aren't recognized. So whether it's our Constitution and our laws or American culture, the reasons for the Revolutionary War, the ascendancy of fascism in this current political moment. I think a lot of those things you can trace back to both colonization and Indigenous resistance. And so we're trying to write to that.
Does anyone have any further questions for Rebecca while we have her here? Well, I wanted to take a moment to kind of synthesize some of the things we talked about, and maybe if anyone has any questions, we can continue or not. But a couple of things that really stuck out to me. One, you talked about in the very beginning of our conversation that sovereignty is not given, it is inherent. And I think that really stuck out to me. Um, we have always been in crisis in some sort of fascist state. And I think it's really important to remind everyone that, we sovereignty is not something that's given to us by a government or, knighted upon us. It's something that we have. Um, I also think, you talking about, Rebecca, the systematic erasure of Native people in media is a really good reminder. Um, and the call to action about complaining and about finding Native voices, I think is really helpful. Someone actually has a question. Any podcasts or any other media you recommend about the topics you've spoken about today, besides obviously your own, which we will always plug and continue to plug.
Yeah, a couple podcasts I would recommend, excuse me, are Stolen by Connie Walker. There's a few seasons that came out on Spotify and Gimlet. Another really great podcast about some of the reproductive and just like it's women centered is All My Relations. Um, and then, this is very heady, but Maggie Blackhawk wrote uh, an Harvard Law Review article called The Constitution of Colonialism or the Constitutionalism of Colonialism. But it's the forward to like the 2023 fall issue of the Harvard Law Review. It's very good. Ned Black, if you just want like an overview of Native history, which I find like a lot of people kind of just like want the overview, Ned Blackhawk's recent book, The Rediscovery of America, is really good.
Awesome. Thank you. We have actually a question. With the continued loss of our elders and language, i.e. Native peoples, do you think that Cherokee Nation will implement a language learning incentive program, similar to something that the Muscogee Nation is doing now in Tulsa? Given sort of the lack of funding for the Living Language program from the federal government. Are there any sorts of ways that you see this
Yeah.
happen? Yeah.
Yeah. So what Cherokee Nation is doing now is there is an immersion school that is K through sixth grade, and they also have a child care for younger children that is immersion. There is a grassroots program that I have volunteered with called Little Cherokee Seeds that is doing immersion with babies through their toddler years to try to create first language speakers again. Cherokee Nation also has an adult program called the Cherokee Language Master Apprentice Program, in which adults spend 2 years learning the Cherokee language, and I did that program too. And then there are smaller like ways that aren't immersion, but sort of more like enrichment, where people can kind of learn some of the basics of the Cherokee language. So there's both online classes and like community classes within the 14 counties.
Really great. If anyone feels compelled to ask any more questions, feel free to do so now, kind of last call for questions. I just wanted to thank you so much for talking with us. And I think what's cool to me about sort of reproductive justice and thinking about reproductive rights outside of just, you know, what we always think of, contraception, abortion alone, that it really expands our conversations into territories that we didn't think possible. It expands our understandings of peoples that we maybe don't even see, right, in the media, in just sort of mainstream media. And it makes us really uncover the varied and just deep issues that come up every time we think about what it means to be in community with each other in the US in a really fraught historical and contemporary moment for Native peoples and all of us. So thank you so much. Um, would you like to plug anything before we kind of let people hop off? Anything that you're working on, anything you want to plug?
Yeah, if people want a way to keep in touch, I started a Substack. So the newsletter is called Native America, and I think you can look up Substack, but my Substack handle is Gohini, Gohini. It's my Cherokee name. So yeah, check it out. Follow me on Substack, subscribe, and thanks so much for coming to the talk. It's great to be in conversation.
Thank you so, so much. It's been really wonderful. And I'm fangirling, personing over you a little bit. So thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you all so much
Yeah,
for coming.
yeah, thanks so much for having me.